For more on today's top political stories, I want to bring in Kris Van Cleave, Marianna Sotomayor, and Christopher Cadelago. Kris is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Marianna is a congressional correspondent for The Washington Post. And Christopher is a White House correspondent for Politico. Welcome to all of you. Christopher, let me start with you. A number of reports say that President Biden is taking on a larger role in negotiations. How has his role in recent weeks changed from the many meetings he's been holding for months?
So over the last few weeks, you've really seen him engaged to a level that he hadn't before. Previous, the White House had been very engaged. Obviously, some of his top negotiators, his top Hill staff had been in on these meetings, had been in constant touch with some of these lawmakers. But he has come in and gotten into meetings where he's talking about these bills, and in particular the reconciliation bill, in a much more granular level, really digging into the policy, whereas earlier on he was trying to find areas of agreement with these lawmakers, seeing how comfortable they were with various policies, how far they might go, what these big numbers look like. Now you're really kind of getting into the nitty-gritty. You're seeing the back and forth with Joe Biden. A lot of his staff talk about these 36 years of experience he had in the Senate, which is something he brings with him to this role. Not every past president has. Kind of just having a feel for the flow of how these things work, when to push, when to pull back. And that's been the feeling there. He's been taking these calls. They sort of describe him as out on the veranda, making call after call, both to the lawmakers involved, but also to folks he knows outside of Washington, just to get a sense from them about how is this really playing in America. And then, of course, you have some of these sort of sporadic trips that he's making to talk about the bill in a more public way, kind of try to sell the components, which have generally polled well. But of course, we haven't seen what that might look like when it's up against GOP opposition.
You know, Christopher, I'm just wondering, is there a sense privately among White House officials that this displeasure that's being voiced by, say, climate activists, other activists, on what is missing in the negotiations or what might be scaled back potentially, is there a sense that that could potentially be a problem, politically speaking, down the road? Or do they think that those voices will eventually kind of come together once legislation is passed?
Yeah, I mean, this is where Joe Biden and the White House are really going to need to come to rely on some of the allies that they've had in Congress who have been helping them, particularly the folks on the left. You think about senators like Bernie Sanders and other folks in the House who have been talking about the need to pass this. You're already starting to see some of that messaging, some of the types of things they're going to talk about this being a historic bill. You go back to when the ARP passed early this year, you were seeing the White House in public quoting statements that Bernie Sanders was making. You're seeing climate activists now talk about elements of the bill that are likely out of it or confirmed to be out of it. And the response to that is, well, there will be enough there, both in this bill and in terms of executive orders, for the president to meet his climate goals. And so it's all going to be about how they talk about it. This is the reconciliation and the infrastructure together. These are massive bills. I mean, you're talking about trillions of dollars in spending just over the last year when you take the rescue plan as well. And so they're going to be able to talk about, if they get these passed, what they've done. And the question is how much stays in it. If they are able to preserve more programs across the board, it will preserve these sort of talking points about things that are in it, even if the lifespan of these provisions is not as long.
All right, Marianna, let's get into the nitty-gritty right now. Obviously, this is very much in a state of flux, but congressional Democrats working with the White House on what stays in the bill, what gets cut. We've heard a lot of back and forth. Where do things stand at this moment?
Like you said, a lot of back and forth, a lot of negotiations. I actually was observing the House floor moments ago when they were voting, and you saw Speaker Nancy Pelosi speaking very privately with Ways and Means Chairman Richie Neal as they try and figure out how to pay for this, what is expected to be between $1.75 trillion and $1.9 trillion. Given the fact that that is a significant scale back, even in pricing from that original 3.5, there are a lot of provisions that are likely going to be either cut or scaled back. The position of the president, the position of Speaker Pelosi, and a lot of progressives is to keep a number of these policies in place and just scale back the reauthorization timelines. But one thing that was very surprising that came out of those meetings between progressive and moderates with the president earlier this week was the fact that he said the child tax credit, which is overwhelmingly popular among all Democrats of all along the ideological spectrum, he proposed actually making that and only extending it for just 1 year. Many Democrats are still hoping to make it permanent, at least extend it for several more years. And Pelosi herself said that she is fighting to make it permanent, but she also concedes that if the president wants it to be only 1 year, then she's going to support that. There's also a number of concerns on the climate front. Many Democrats, of course, wanting to cut carbon emissions by a certain timeline, whether it's 2030, 2050, Manchin against a number of those proposals. So many senators and members involved in that still trying to figure out how best to do that to appease a number of Democrats. Also, there's the healthcare component. Do you fund Medicare expansion in some way to the expense of the Affordable Care Act and making those subsidies permanent? So there are still a number of the debates that we've been talking about for several weeks here that are still under consideration. They're still talking about it, and many people are definitely feeling more confident that they could get and strike a deal soon, but those nitty-gritty details are still being worked out at this hour.
Right, the number of issues to contend with really underscores just the enormity of this package. Meantime, Kris, 5 military veterans on an advisory committee for Senator Kyrsten Sinema resigned Thursday. Now, Senator Sinema responded saying, quote, "While it is unfortunate that apparent disagreement on separate policy issues has led to this decision, I thank them for their service and will continue working every day to deliver for Arizona's veterans." So why did they quit, Kris?
Well, their argument in a letter to the senator is that she's been more of an obstructionist than a maverick. You know, she likes to model herself on Senator John McCain, who is known as a maverick. They say instead what she has done is been an obstruction to passing things like the Build Back Better agenda. They cite drug prices. One of her campaign promises has been to bring down drug prices. She's been opposed to measures that would do that inside of the president's plan. So basically, they in this letter say they felt like they're being treated as window dressing, veterans that are there to in some way to benefit the senator, and by looking like she's got a team of veterans that are advising her, but yet not executing on things they believe need to happen for the country.
Well, Marianna, Senator Sinema says she opposes any increase in marginal rates for businesses, high-income individuals, or capital gains. So where does that leave the White House in trying to pay for this?
Yeah, that's right. They're really going back and forth and negotiating with leaders here on Capitol Hill. And it seems like one of the things that the White House has proposed is actually taxing billionaires, taxing them more. And that seems to be something that Sinema is also on board with. And I actually do want to point out we do have some new reporting to a source familiar with Sinema's thinking and those discussions in the White House. And what they say is that Senator Sinema has actually agreed to provisions in each of President Biden's 4 proposed revenue categories. Those are international, domestic corporate, high net worth individuals, and also tax enforcement. So we don't know the breakdown of what exactly that means and who's going to be involved and, you know, where that money or how much those either corporations or people, individuals are going to be taxed. But that is a step forward. Even the fact that Sinema's team is putting forward a little bit into her thinking is a significant step since we haven't really heard much from them. So we are, as you're seeing, little baby steps to getting closer to a negotiation and I should say closer to a deal that the White House is really trying to broker between Sinema, of course, Manchin, and other congressional leaders.
That is really notable to hear that window into her thinking, because Kris was telling us yesterday how she has really stayed away from telegraphing where she stands on any of this and is not one of those people, unlike Senator Manchin, Kris, you were telling us, who is out before the cameras. She has not made herself available in that way. So we'll continue to watch that. Meantime, Kris, Attorney General Merrick Garland appeared before the House Judiciary Committee today to testify on Steve Bannon's contempt referral. What was the Attorney General's overall message?
He said he was speaking before the House had moved to refer this contempt finding. He said if that happens, that the Department of Justice will review the facts of the matter and take action as determined by law. If they decide to move forward, that would be to present it to a grand jury. If the grand jury determines an indictment is warranted, Bannon has the potential of facing up to a year behind bars and up to a $100,000 fine. Interesting thing in the statute about contempt of Congress, it does require at least 1 month of that sentence to be spent behind bars.
Well, Christopher, you reported that in a private presentation this week, Senate Democrats are being warned of a rough road ahead for the midterms. Who issued the report, and what may be making Democrats nervous?
So this is the main super PAC for Senate Democrats, led by Chuck Schumer, the Senate leader. And there have been a number of Democratic consultants over the last week or so, last week and a half, who have been in on these presentations done by the Senate Majority PAC that have looked at all of the targeted districts that are up in the Senate in 2 years, or next year in 2022 in the midterms, and looked at kind of the messaging that might work, what position they're in. And this poll had some real troubling signs for Democrats in these states, primarily a real tumbling of Joe Biden's approval rating, which is very much in line with what we've seen in national polls occurring in all of these battleground Senate states, as well as these numbers of so-called persuadable voters, who are folks who are on the fence that can be persuaded to vote for Democrats to keep the Senate. Their numbers in a lot of these questions have been shockingly low to these consultants and these folks who have reviewed the poll, which is another warning. A lot of things that are not all that surprising, frankly. COVID has had a massive impact, both in how folks are viewing the president and Democrats, just the fact that it has dragged on this long. And then, of course, the resulting economic impacts on people's lives, supply chain issues. People can't get goods, in time. And they're just feeling these lingering effects of COVID that have just not gone away, despite kind of feeling better over the summer. And that is just really having an impact on Democrats across the board. Of course, folks feel like they could get some sort of bump if this legislation that we've been talking about passes. It's not going to be the savior for Democrats. It's unlikely to be in the midterms, but it would certainly give them a bump, give them a whole bunch of things they could point to that they've delivered on in terms of promises. But really, they're going to have to hope that this increase in vaccines, these mandates, kids getting vaccinated, people getting the boosters, and then, of course, the work that the White House has been doing to sort of free up the bottlenecks in the supply chain and get the economy rolling will start to impact on people's lives, and that they'll start to feel like things are going better, because you look at this poll and it's over 50% feeling like the economy is worse off than when Biden took over, and much lower numbers, lower than just 3 in 10 of these voters feeling like things have gotten better.
And you wonder, if legislation is passed, will voters give credit to Democrats and the Biden administration? Because, you wonder, if they're far removed from the event itself, who is it that they will hold responsible for whatever it is they're feeling? All right, Kris Van Cleave, Marianna Sotomayor, and Christopher Cadelago, thank you all very much.